Welcome everyone to our 2025 Irma Mortar Lecture with our honored guest, the poet James Cruz. Welcome, James. Great to have you with us. Before we begin, I just want to say thank you to the whole Irma Mortar Lecture team of this year. Our intrepid leader, Lila Dott. Thank you, Lila, for bringing James to us. Thank you, Lila. And also Nancy Cross-Dunham and Jackie Zandy and the entire Poetry Contemplation group. It's wonderful to have you all here. You are all part of bringing James to us. And Reverend Kimberly Tom Jack Carlson, who was also part of the team and has been a wonderful support in publicity and also in sharing James's work with the children and the youth of the church. So we're very excited to have you today, James, and also tomorrow. Before I introduce James, I just want to say a little bit about Irma Mortar. So Irma Mortar was a first church member who generously donated funds to create the Irma Mortar Annual Lecture, and we are here at one of the annual lectures. Irma Mortar lived life as a grand adventure. She savored the works of philosophers like Marcus Aurelius and Plato, believing in the necessity of people taking responsibility for their communities and for working together. Irma Mortar made a bequest to First Church in support of a lecture series on topics related to individual responsibility. Our Irma Mortar lecture team has defined individual responsibility, a very broad concept, as the way that we find responsibilities in the decisions we make and our behavior towards others by acknowledging that we are all accountable for the things we do and the attitudes we adopt. Responsible acts aim for intentional promotion of the good in every sphere of our lives. Irma Mortar, thank you. We're delighted to be here. James Cruz, who is with us, is part of the wonderful labor of returning poetry to its sacred place in everyday life. He's the editor of several best-selling and prize-winning books, including Kindness Will Save the World, The Path to Kindness, Poems of Connection and Joy, and How to Love the World, Poems of Gratitude and Hope, which has over 100,000 copies in print. James Cruz has been featured on NPR's Morning Edition and in the Washington Post, the New Republic, the New York Times Magazine, among many other publications. He is the author of 4 prize-winning books of poetry, The Book of What Stays, Telling My Father, Bluebird, and Every Waking Moment. James also speaks and leads workshops on kindness, you might have guessed, as well as mindfulness and writing for self-compassion. And in fact, tomorrow afternoon after church from 1 to 2:30 here, James will lead such a writing workshop here at First Church. So I hope you'll be able to join us for that. James lives with his husband on 40 rocky acres in the woods of southern Vermont. James.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to all the folks that Reverend Jennifer mentioned, and thank you, Reverend Jennifer, for the beautiful, heartfelt introduction. It's really lovely to be in this sacred space with you, and I do often say that my goal is to create a sacred space on the page, whether I'm leading workshops like I will tomorrow or writing books, editing books. I really believe that poetry can unlock the heart and can bring us more deeply into our everyday lives. So I would love to just start with a brief little arrival meditation, if you wouldn't mind indulging me in this. So I'm just going to invite you, if you feel comfortable, to just close your eyes or look down and just notice where you are. Just feel the solid pew beneath you, your feet on the earth. Hearing the sounds in the room, the fans, the movements, other people breathing. And I'll just invite you to bring a very soft attention to your own breath as it goes in and out of your body. So just noticing that breath that works on its own, doesn't need to be told what to do. Just noticing any thoughts you might be carrying with you, any sensations in the body. And knowing that everything is welcome today, everything is welcome here. We don't have to hold anything back. Just giving that slight attention to the breath. As it comes in, goes out. And we'll just have another moment of silence before we come back together. Again, just noticing the breath, listening to the sounds in the room. And we'll just slowly come back together, opening our eyes, noticing each other again. Thank you for indulging me in that. I've never actually started a talk or a lecture with a meditation, but it just felt right today, and it feels very right for these times that we're living through right now. So what I'm going to share with you today is really just a blend of poetry, prose. I'm going to share a little bit about how I came to poetry in the first place, and really how I use certain poems and poetry in my daily life as a practice, a spiritual practice, but also a practice to coming back to just everyday, ordinary existence and appreciating what's here, even if that happens to be grief, difficulty, depression, anger, joy, delight, whatever it is. Poetry for me has always been a gateway into creating that safe, sacred space for everything to arise. And the best poems for me embody that. They don't leave anything out. They're very honest. So this first poem that I'd like to share is called How to Listen. Listening is a form of worship, but you don't have to kneel on the floor with folded hands or mouth the perfect prayer. Just open the door of yourself to another. Become the space they step through to to show you who they really are. This is holiness, two people seated together on the pew of a park bench, at the altar of a kitchen table. Even if no one says a word for a while, receive the silence until it's like a language only the two of you can speak. It can feel in our current climate that we've lost the ability to actually listen to each other. It can also feel like we are being asked to hold our own daily personal sorrows alongside a larger global grief. Still, we know it's a gift when someone shows up wholeheartedly for us, shelving their agendas, unlocking the door of themselves so that we may enter a more authentic place together. We know what it feels like not to be seen and heard, to have our pain dismissed by others, and perhaps at times by ourselves as well. Yet the mutual practice of deep listening is one of the most healing acts we can offer, because our full presence with someone does the talking for us. Consider the people in your life who will stay by your side, even when it's uncomfortable, even when all that's exchanged is silence. I think of my husband, my therapist, a few good friends, all of whom are unafraid of silences that can go on for so long they become a language all their own. We've lost a sense of ritual when it comes to loss and the larger griefs of the world. In our distracted and overly rushed culture, we often look past the possibility of deep listening, perhaps because showing up is such hard work. I'm just as guilty of this as anyone else. Yet my own practices of prayer, meditation, and poetry all bring me back to the deeper presence that allows me to listen and simply receive. As we integrate the unthinkable slowly into our lives, into our bodies and minds, perhaps we begin to seek out those people and places where we will feel most known, far beyond the surface of things. We need teachers, spiritual directors, priests, chaplains, yoga teachers, meditation guides, life coaches, and all the helpers who serve as examples of how we can practice listening to each other again, even when we disagree, perhaps especially when we disagree. Anyone who allows us to speak of real things, asking questions and leaving rooms for answers, becomes sacred to us through the generous attention of their unlocked heart. A park bench or couch can become a pew. A kitchen table or favorite hiking trail can turn into an altar we regularly visit with a friend or family member whom we trust to hold our pain and joy, and whose pain and joy we too learn to hold without feeling the need to fix or mend a thing for them. Our presence alone is the balm we all need, and I believe that poetry knows this. It has been reminding me of this truth for nearly 40 years now. I began writing poems in the 3rd grade when my teacher, the Venerable Mrs. Brown, required us to memorize and recite a new poem every week. Now at first, I turned to Shel Silverstein, of course, one of my favorites, and that was enough for a while. That was fun. But then, somehow, though I was a shy and completely introverted kid, I worked up the courage to approach her desk and ask if I could write and recite my own poems to the class. Now I need you all to know that I was the shyest kid in the class and had such a fear of public speaking. I'm still having a conversation with my 8-year-old self, trying to convince him that this is part of what we do for a living now. You know, it's kind of weird. Somehow, I stood there and asked her if I could do this. And I have been blessed ever since that she clapped her hands and said, yes, absolutely. Write, memorize, and recite your own poems. What a great idea. And I think about that moment quite often because it could have gone the other way. I was breaking the rules. She wanted us to memorize and recite a poem that had already been published, that was written by someone that we were studying or talking about in class, and yet she said yes. Here I am, standing before you, a poet of all things. The first poem I wrote was called Ode to Summer. I wish I still had it, but it is lost to time, and maybe that's a good thing. But I still remember friends coming up to me during recess, confessing how much they'd enjoyed my poems, slapping me on the back, surprised that I could write something out of the blue like that. Seeing other people react to something that I had just pulled out of the thin air made me want to do this again and again and again. So in spite of the fears and doubts that so often accompany the process, I kept going. I kept chasing that feeling of creating something that could affect people, maybe even help people spark their imagination or spark a moment of joy. I love to write poems that anyone can enter, young and old, poetry lovers and poetry not so lovers, because I see writing as a healing practice. And I think I have said in other publications, I see it as the ultimate healing practice. That might be a little hyperbolic, but some days I really believe it. I really trust in the power of putting words onto the page, getting whatever is inside of us out, even if it doesn't take the shape of a poem, even if it doesn't look like we thought it would look when we imagined it in our heads. Some of us may not be experienced writers, but most of us can write and have even tried our hand at poetry at some point. Like the late great poet William Stafford, I believe that we were all born poets and that life just slowly took us away from that imaginary poet self that we inhabited so effortlessly as kids. We're not often encouraged to keep flexing that muscle, and because many of us have been discouraged at certain points in our lives, we forget that imagination remains open and available to us at all times. We forget that we're every day making associations, creating simile and metaphor effortlessly, on our own. We're not calling ourselves poets, but we're doing this anyway. One of the best examples of this, I went to graduate school in Lincoln, Nebraska, home of the Cornhuskers. And I remember, now I never kept up on the schedule, but I remember happening to be downtown on a game day and becoming a part of the sea of red that was flowing toward the stadium and thinking, what did I get myself into? And then I overhear this conversation I will never forget. And this man said, we're all like salmon running. through the river. And I just I think I stopped oh my gosh, this football fan just made a metaphor that completely rocked my world. So we're doing this all the time. We are poets, whether we want to admit it or not. And I think what we sometimes miss about poetry is that it's so subtle. And the ways in which it can help us, can you tell I'm trying to convert you? The ways in which it can help us each day in our daily griefs, holding on to moments of presence, delight, are countless. But they are also often very small. There are moments that we might just pass by or ignore because they seem so slight, almost like micro moments of warmth. And this next poem is one that is very special to me because it actually sparked the connection that has brought me to Milwaukee twice now. This was a connection that deeply touched Lila Dott, who we mentioned earlier, and her husband, Alan Jacobson. And it's a great example of a poem touching people all the way across the country, strangers to me. I had no idea who they were. I had no idea that when I wrote this poem, it would bring me here twice, and I would be staying with these people who were so moved by this poem. Sometimes if you can receive something and share it, it goes on to touch other people in ways you don't imagine. And that has certainly been my experience with poetry over the years. But this poem was written during the very fresh grief of loss. My mother died about 3 years ago, come this November. And she died suddenly. She was 64 years old. So it came as a surprise, and I had been a caretaker for her for many, many years, really most of my adult life. And so this poem came as almost out of the ether. It came as a great comfort to me, because in those first months, as I was casting about, at a loss for purpose, at a loss for believing that this heavy grief was going to pass, just this little moment captured me and stayed with me and gave me hope that, as we say, this too shall pass, but not so much pass as change. Gave me the hope that this grief would change into something else and that I would be able to appreciate the world again. So this is called A Slice of Actual Light. And then one day, life placed a slice of actual light on your plate. Instead of the usual portion of grief you thought would be your daily meal for the rest of your time on earth. You just turned and saw a patch of winter sun sliding up and down the wall beside the bed. Last gasp of daylight, so inviting. How could you not reach out and touch the heat that had slipped through a momentary crack in the clouds? Now believe this will keep happening. These glimmers gathering to overtake the long shadow of sorrow for whole minutes, even hours at a time. So, one of the most difficult aspects of being caught in loss, held in the grips of despair, is that part of us believes it's never going to go away. It's never going to change. And yet, these small moments come as reminders. And it takes so little for us to remember that these periods are really temporary. The world still calls to us in blinks and whispers so subtle, they're often hard to notice. This whisper came to me in the months after my mother's death, in the middle of winter in Vermont, when light was very hard to come by. As I crawled into bed to read before supper, I thought about the long stretch of cold, snowy days ahead and felt overwhelmed, helpless in the face of my pain. Suddenly, I turned to catch a slice of light sliding up and down the wall beside my bed. It was the simplest thing, there for a moment, gone in a flash. But reaching out to touch those few weak rays of setting sun gave me the hope that I wouldn't always feel so locked in sorrow. I saw that eventually some flavor might return to my days again. I might find a structure that lent purpose to my life again. We may not believe it yet, that more and more such glimmers will slowly overtake the long shadow of whatever griefs we might be carrying. Maybe we can turn toward each other. Maybe we can turn toward nature and recall how often the light finds its way through. And if you read me at all, you'll probably know that nature is a constant source of solace for me. I live on those 40 rocky acres in Vermont, and I don't say that to brag. I actually say that so that people don't imagine these gentle, rolling hills where things grow effortlessly. You don't have to pull rocks out of the ground just to plant a few flowers. Nonetheless, I love where I live, and I love living that close to nature. And even while I'm on the road, even while I'm traveling, I love being able to stay in touch with some sense of a world that exists beyond our human created world. This next poem is about nature coming closer to our lives than we might have expected. My husband, of course, is a farmer, and so he keeps a tractor parked outside of our house at all times. And some winter wrens decided that this would be the perfect place to make their home. And this is the poem. So much space for song. What made the winter wren say, "This is my home now," as it carried stick after stick and tufts of grass to the tractor, shaping a soft place inside the arm that lifts the bucket? What gave such a small body so much space for song, belting out notes from its perch on top of the seat, chirping if we got too close to that hollow where her young are now hatching, calling out in hunger? What fills any of us with care enough to say yes to this difficult world, taking our places in it despite the risks, knowing the dangers? Watch how the wren shrinks itself to fit inside the tractor we haven't driven in weeks, where tiny beings have emerged from eggs the size of marbles, each one filled with the songs of their mother and father, a music that is larger than this one life we are given. To me, love means continually saying yes to this rough and difficult world, what some other spiritual thinkers have called the Earth School. where what we cherish most must also fade and leave us, where we must mourn the loss of so much. But maybe nature can teach us that spirits are larger and more resilient than these bodies we were given. And there is still so much space for song, joy, celebration of the life that remains inside us. I felt this when my husband Brad and I discovered that family of wrens living in the most unlikely of places, having made a nest inside the metal arm of our tractor, and it was the most narrow space you can imagine too, these little sticks sticking out. Just as soon as I'd feel lost in thought and memory, however, I would hear that winter wren perched on top of the tractor seat, belting out that morning's irrepressible song. And, they're probably about a little bit bigger than this, and somehow these huge songs come out of these tiny, tiny bodies. It was so healing to hear that daily music, to be called back to a world I often felt I could not trust anymore in the midst of my grief. I couldn't help but feel that even as the wrens made a soft place in the tractor for their young, they were also building a gentle place for my own sorrow to rest in for a while. We didn't drive the tractor, though it drove my farmer husband crazy, keeping watch until their young had finally emerged from the eggs, finally fledged the nest. Yet I couldn't stop asking the question which remains central to this poem and to my life. What gives any of us love enough to say yes to the fleeting world, knowing those dangers and somehow every day accepting those risks? We may feel some part of ourselves holding back from life right now, refusing love, afraid of entering the space of grief. But look at the wrens so filled with song, it bursts forth from them, trembling their tiny bodies. They make nest after nest in the places that seem safest, constantly moving on, drawn by a strong sense of purpose and devotion. Slowly, gently, perhaps we too can start to feel our own purpose stirring again in the simplest of ways. Preparing a meal for loved ones, doing a few chores unasked for. Soon we may see that we too can learn to live out in the open, in the landscape of this changed world, no longer holding back the joy of being alive, simply because we must also hold the reality of our fears for the future. As you can probably tell, some of my favorite subjects are joy and sorrow. And I have a new book coming out this fall called Turning Toward Grief. And I actually did a search in the document for this book because I was curious. It felt to me like I was very serious about meeting the sorrow, meeting the grief that I was feeling at the time, especially when I wrote it. But there's also this very joyful aspect to the poems that I didn't expect at all. And so I did a search in the document to see how many times the word joy shows up. 40 times in the book. And it's a pretty short book, but the word joy shows up 40 times. So I thought, okay, this is obviously an obsession of mine. And I think it is because Oftentimes, when we're in a difficult spot, it can feel like, oh, I'm supposed to be feeling grief. I'm supposed to be in mourning. I'm supposed to be angry and doing this and doing that, which means I'm not allowed to feel joy anymore. And I feel like for myself, my mission is to refute that and show myself and others whom I meet that joy is still possible in the midst of difficulty. We just have to make that effort. And oftentimes joy shows up in very unexpected ways. One source of recent joy for me, I guess not so recent now, maybe a few years ago, around our house, my husband has planted this gorgeous perennial garden. And so much effort, so much fertilizer spread on the mulch around this garden. And what do I come to appreciate? What gives me a sense of joy? A volunteer sunflower that has grown on its own. And so this volunteer sunflower got a poem of its own, much to the chagrin of my husband. And this is called Sunflower. Begins with a rather famous line from Mary Oliver that you'll probably recognize. Joy is not made to be a crumb, Mary Oliver once wrote. But isn't that how it often shows up at first? One crumb of attention, then another, and another, until you're able to follow the trail leading to the volunteer sunflower you hadn't noticed, blooming beside the garden. Volunteer, we say, meaning no human hand nestled that seed in the ground, though the same could be said of joy too, which seems to spring up out of nowhere when we see the face of that flower the French call tournesol, meaning turn toward the sun. And don't we each carry a small sun in our chests that tells us where to turn, where it's warm, where something bright has struggled up out of the earth and is now calling our name? So this poem also came to me at the end of a difficult day, and oftentimes poetry shows up for me as a break in an emotion that seemed monolithic, that seemed like it would never alter or switch at all. I happened to be walking around the yard and noticed this flower that was probably planted by a squirrel, bearing a sunflower seed in the ground. And it just lifted my spirit, unbidden, surprising to me, as I mentioned, surprising to my husband as well. But I think that is the beauty of poetry to me. If there's a word that also recurs in much of my poems, it is also the word small. So oftentimes these small things, these small moments, these small beings are the things that call to me the most. This next poem is about another one of those moments and also came as quite a comfort to me as I was thinking about what's going on in our country and in our world. As I woke up in the middle of the night gripped with fear and worry. And this one is called Small Pleasures. Some nights, the ache in your chest for all that's wrong in your life, for all the cruelty of this world, will wake you with its crackling bonfire of fears. But other nights you will fall asleep to the scent of peonies left, breathing in a vase on the dresser, that bouquet of burst open hearts, the last thing you see before closing your eyes. You live, as we all do, between these extremes, learning to lean in the direction of whatever small pleasures you can gather from your own backyard. So, of course, I had to write a poem about the flowers that were actually cultivated in our garden. And, this poem feels very special to me because it speaks to these extremes that I feel we are living in so constantly these days. Cruelty, fear, uncertainty on one side, and the access to wonder, awe, even these tiny little pleasures on the other. These emotions are always dancing and intertwining together inside us. And it is a dizzying and stressful time to be alive, to say the least. But I often think of how the singer, songwriter, and practicing Quaker, Carrie Newcomer, responded when I recently asked her what's keeping her sane and centered at the moment. Leaning into beauty was all she said, giving me and everyone else listening in on our conversation the permission to do the same. Most days as I sit down to write, though I never know what's going to come, though I never force it, I'm aware of how often my work focuses on these tiny openings, what I often call these little aches of aliveness. I believe that giving our attention to such instances of rest and renewal, no matter how often we have to remind ourselves, can bring us more alive. Surrendering to them can feel like an act of radical self-compassion, given all that's happening at this moment. We want to stay informed, yet absorbing too much news can lead to numbness, or what some have called compassion fatigue. We need to give in to things that bring us relief as well, if we are fortunate enough to have access to them. Even now, I'm aware of my own good luck sharing this sacred space with each of you, friends old and new. And isn't this why we're here? To feel both the aches and pleasures of life as deeply as we can. We tend to think that peace lives just over there, in another country, in a cabin in the woods, in a retreat center where we might escape the noise of the world. But true relief, true refuge can sometimes be found right where we are, leaning into whatever beauty happens to be available. More and more as I keep up my daily writing practice, waking up, making a huge cup of coffee, sitting down before dawn, and just opening my notebook, letting whatever wants to come through me. I have come to see poetry as its own form of prayer, meditation. The language struggles to hold what it really does for me. It's a way of noticing and holding so much of what seems uncontainable in our lives. The few hours I spend at my desk in the quiet now feel like a sacred time for me, a way of touching in on the ordinary holiness that surrounds us, often even in the most trying of circumstances. This is another poem that touches on where we are right now and what some of us might be feeling. And this one is called Kintsugi again. Many of you probably know the Japanese art of kintsugi, which is filling the cracks in ceramic with powdered gold or platinum. And so this is a slightly different take on that practice. Kintsugi again. In the Japanese art of mending ceramics with powdered gold, no one ever talks about how they'd leave the pots, cups, and cracked bowls broken for a while, sometimes whole generations. And so I say to you, let your heart stay shattered in your chest. Let it ache. Some may claim you've now been broken open and can let in the light. This might be true, but before you rush to gloss over the wounds, filling the holes with gold so they glimmer, try to find beauty in the broken places too. Proof of where the fire left its marks on you. When we find ourselves broken, others may rush in to try and comfort us, offering whatever words they can. More than once, some well-meaning friend has tried to give me solace in the midst of my sorrow by pointing out that my loved ones are in a better place, that my heart may be broken, but it's also broken open, that the grief will eventually pass. You know these things that we say to one another because we don't know what else to say, and we want to try to make it better. But even if our heart is broken, letting it stay broken can be a practice. We can learn something in the midst of this that we didn't know before. I feel this is true of any pain that we're able to stay with even for just an extra moment or two. That it opens us more to love, life, and the whole overwhelming world. Though none of us would invite pain, none of us would welcome it if it came knocking. As a culture, I feel we sometimes move too fast toward healing. I think this is partly why the idea of kintsugi has taken over so much, that it has entered our lexicon, because we want this belief that our problems, our scars, can somehow be made to shine and be made more valuable. But what if we just let the brokenness be its own kind of beauty? I've been guilty of this myself, trying to gloss over the wounds, trying so hard to look for the silver lining that I miss the storm that's actually trying to pass through me, that's trying to do its sacred work. Maybe that's why this poem came to me one morning during a long walk the year after my mother's death. I usually write in a notebook, as I mentioned, but this poem had such urgency. I had to stop on the trail where I was walking and tap it into my phone, which I never like to do. I always prefer a notebook. But this poem really wanted to be born, and I think more than that, the lesson of the poem wanted to be born and implanted in me. I'd been thinking about those words of well-meaning friends and loved ones, and the way that the Japanese practice of kintsugi has become such a commonplace metaphor for how to meet trauma and pain. But I also remember that a dear friend of mine, poet you may know, Rosemary Watola Tromer, told me after speaking about kintsugi together, that actually the practice is much more complicated than just rushing to fill those cracks with gold. Often those pieces of pottery are allowed to stay broken for a long time, whole generations before they are finally repaired. This begs the question, can we give ourselves the same permission to stay with whatever comes up for us for as long as we need to, without trying to rush and fix it? I mentioned that I've come to see poetry as a form of prayer, and very much like poetry, I hid in my bedroom, wrote in my notebooks, and I also prayed in secret as a child. My parents never shamed me, but we also never went to church. We were not spiritual people, and I hadn't met many spiritual or religious people in my youth. Still, I sensed this larger presence that went beyond the usual concepts of God, the white beard, white hair that I knew from movies. Each night before bed, I pulled the sheets and blanket over my head so my brother wouldn't hear me, folded my hands, and did what I was never taught to do. I spoke to that larger force. At first, most often asking for things, a new bike, money, more money, but then also feeling the relief of surrendering those childhood problems, surrendering the troubles that I felt I had to whatever or whomever I imagined beyond that ceiling and the sky. This is how poetry has worked for me as well. As you can tell from what I've shared so far today, in tough times, in tough moments, even when I don't feel like it, I show up to the page. I turn to poetry and ask what it has to teach me. I receive, I retrieve, not so much create, but welcome and allow whatever comes through. Many of us might begin by framing the sacred as something outside of ourselves, and only eventually, with reflection and practice, come to the same conclusion as so many of the poems I've shared, that everything in us is a sacrament. As Jane Mead says in the final lines of her poem concerning that prayer I cannot make, listen, I am holy. Isn't this the first and most essential step toward a spiritual life? Recognizing we too are the prayer spoken through the world. When I began writing poems encouraged by my tireless and devoted teacher, I felt even then that writing came from the same place as my attempts at prayer, a kind of giving over to a voice that felt wiser and far more compassionate than the voice in my head. Back then, while walking around the old oaks in our yard or sitting beside a creek, poems formed themselves in my mind, asking even then to be written down and shared. Each one startled me back into direct conversation with the world. And this, I feel, is the starting point for those emotions I've mentioned: joy, delight, reclaiming our own aliveness. Poetry emerges out of what May Sarton has called the warm, faithful waiting contained in one's smallness. I'll say that again. The warm, faithful waiting contained in one's smallness. I feel like that could have been the whole talk today, and we might have been good. And it also comes out of what David White has named some other place we intuit and know in the darkness. Smallness, darkness. You'll notice that the language struggles to hold the mystery of this space in each of us. Yet the strength of poetry and any form of art, I feel, really, is that it embraces the struggle, allowing each intertwined feeling or insight to become holy in and of itself. The poems I love most do not separate the so-called positive from the negative, but instead offer footholds for us when we face the abyss or slip into sudden delight. The best poems for me always include and allow, offering a kind of proof of the author's true self, their pride-open heart, this human journey. I think that's all I have. Thank you so much for listening today. Now, because I managed to hold myself back, because I have way more poems and prose than I actually shared with you, we have time for questions, if anybody has any questions. And I don't want any of you to feel any pressure. We're not in school, so you don't get extra points, at least not from me. Maybe from other people in the room, you'll get extra points if you have a question. Yeah.
Can you remind me of the name of the poem about the winter wrens?
Yes. So the question was to remind about the name of the poem about the now famous winter wrens. And that one is called So Much Space for Song. And it's in this new book that'll be out in late October, but you can also find it online because it was published in Rattle, and you can hear me read it again too, if you want to do that. Yeah. I wish that there were songs of winter wrens playing in the background. I should have thought about that maybe, but yeah, thank you for asking.
Are there poets that you turn to yourself, or that you started sort of learning from informally or formally yourself over the years that you use as special values?
Yeah. So the question is poets that I've turned to that have shaped me over the years. And there are many. I've published a number of anthologies filled with many of my favorites. I have too many to name, but I would say the ones that have shaped me the most are currently, I'll say, Mark Nepo, for sure, who is both a poet and a philosopher. Ted Kooser, who was the reason I made that pilgrimage to Lincoln, Nebraska and got caught in the sea of red Cornhuskers. And other folks include Naomi Shihab Nye. There's a newer Palestinian poet, a younger person who's spoken very much about the tragedy in Gaza. His name is Mossab Abu Toha, Toha. And who else? I would say Ada Limon, Ross Gay, whose poetry I love, whose book, The Book of Delights, you may already know about it, but it is a wonderful book and will instantly lift your spirits. And those are the people I turn to most often, I would say. Mark Nepo publishes almost a book a year, which is good for me because I love actually starting, I do some sort of sacred reading each morning before I start writing, and I most often pick up one of his books and read, because he is a beautiful metaphor maker, and it really stretches your mind to see what it can accommodate. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah. Say again, I didn't hear you.
I believe that you were the poet that wrote a poem after the election and how you were feeling and let's see, Lila sent it to me. And then I sent it on.
Oh, yeah.
Did you write something?
Well, I write almost every day, so odds are I probably did write something after the election about how I was feeling. My guess is the poem that you're talking about, I wrote a poem that, I don't know if you could say it went viral, but it was shared by a lot of folks. And it was after what Fred Rogers used to say, to look for the helpers. Does that ring a bell? Maybe, maybe not, I don't know. That was the one that traveled the most right after. I wrote that the morning after the election. And so, yeah, maybe that was it. Yeah.
I learned many years ago from an advisor to the Dalai Lama that each of us, no matter how hard the times become, we can help by taming the crazy elephant in ourselves. And as I listened both to you talking and your poems, I realized that you encourage us and inspire us to do that, to find the peace within. And I know you said when you were younger, you appreciated how people, even the kids, liked your poems. Does this ever get overwhelming? Because I think it's a powerful message that you have, and you express it so beautifully. And I don't think people realize how poetry from the heart helps to tame the crazy elephant and helps others to tame theirs. So how do you feel about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel like I have been called to do this. And like I mentioned, I am an introvert. I'm kind of a homebody. I really, I would be happy just with a very small, circumscribed world. But I've been called to do something that's different than that, and to share this message in my own way. And so I appreciate what you say about feeling that intention behind the work, which is to encourage, inspire, uplift. As I tried to make clear in what I was sharing, I have a very busy mind. I mean, don't let my calm demeanor fool you for 1 second. I have a very anxious, very busy mind, and I turn to poetry. I mean, there are many other tools I use as well, but poetry is one of the big ones because there's something very embodied about having to put words on the page and having to describe what's moving through you. And I find that the act of doing that, and doing that in such a way that, with poetry you have line breaks, so you have these natural pauses at the end of each line where you can take a slight breath, a slight breath, a slight breath before going on. And if you've put a lot of attention into bringing those words together, probably those words, when you speak them, are going to slow you down a bit too. Because even though I'm trying to write poetry that's accessible, that is like an unlocked door, poetry can still be dense, so it requires some presence and attention. And I think anything that asks presence and attention is going to naturally cause us to slow down. So when I least want to do it, when my mind is most busy, a lot of times I will, look out first and see what I can notice, and then open a notebook and just start writing and seeing what comes to me. No pressure to write a publishable poem, whatever that means. No pressure to write anything beautiful. My dear friend Rosemary, whom I mentioned, says it doesn't have to be good, it just has to be true. So that's helpful as well. And it's just these small moments, like I said. Even before we started today, the sun was coming through that window magically. And I just had to stop and take a picture of that. I really had to notice that. So it takes so little, I think, but those tiny pauses, I think, that are built into poetry especially, can really help slow down the roaring, rearing elephant of the mind. Yeah.
As an adult, have you been able to thank Mrs. Brown?
No, unfortunately, she is no longer with us. And what I think happened is, because years ago I tried to track her down and find her, but she had retired and relocated elsewhere because I grew up near St. Louis, Missouri, and of course the school can't, I don't think, give out information about the teachers. So even on social media, I was not able to track her down, unfortunately. But she definitely lives on in my heart. And she, it's sort of like when you grow up and your parents make sacrifices for you, but they also make a lot of mistakes, and you forget about the sacrifices and the good things and focus on the mistakes. Well, I didn't have perfect teachers, but I've realized in retrospect what an amazing, different teacher Mrs. Brown was for me. And I really revered her when I was in 3rd grade. She was, obviously, she changed my life. And so thank you for asking that. I really wish, if this were an episode of Oprah, someone would have her here and would be able to bring her out and surprise me, and we'd all be in tears. But real life isn't like Oprah, unfortunately. Anybody else? All right. Well, thank you so much for being here today. I'll be hanging out, so if you think of anything, you can always let me know. Oh, thank you. Well, I was going to say, these little cards here, they're not just advertisements, they have poems on them. So if you want to take a poem with you, or a couple, please feel free to do so.
And James is planning on sitting here. If you've brought any of his books with you, you can come and get them signed. Also, he will be here tomorrow morning at service at 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. Of course, you are all welcome to that. He'll be reading some of the poems. Only one, I think, is a crossover from today until tomorrow. So you'll have new poems from him tomorrow, and we'll do some meditative practice about those poems in worship tomorrow. And then again, at 1 p.m., there will be a poetry writing workshop that you can attend here at First Church. So for the folks online, the 9 a.m. worship service will be live streamed. We hope to see you there. Okay, thanks everyone for coming.